This is the story of how a black man teaches a rich man a lesson he never expected. The rich man had everything: money, power, and arrogance. When he belittled a black man in front of everyone, he never imagined that moment would change his life forever. But the black man taught him a lesson he never expected, leaving him speechless. The restaurant was one of the most expensive in the city. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their soft golden glow reflecting off polished marble floors. The clinking of fine silverware and the murmur of polite conversation filled the air, a symphony of wealth and privilege. This was a place where only the richest dined, where people like Martin Whitmore felt right at home. Martin was a man who had everything. His tailored suit, imported from Italy, fit his tall frame perfectly. His gold watch gleamed under the dim lights, and the way he carried himself made it clear he was someone important. To him, success was measured in wealth, and he had no patience for those who had less. Seated at his usual table by the window, Martin glanced at his reflection in the glass. He smirked. Another profitable day, another deal closed. Life was good. He picked up his wine glass, swirling the liquid before taking a slow sip. But then something, or rather, someone, caught his attention. A black man had just stepped into the restaurant. He was dressed in simple, neatly pressed clothes, nothing extravagant, but presentable. Yet, to Martin, he did not belong here. Martin raised an eyebrow, watching as the man confidently approached the hostess. "Yes, sir, how many will be dining with you tonight?" she asked politely. "Just me," the man replied, his voice calm and steady. Martin scoffed. Why was he here? Did he even know how much a meal cost in this place? The hostess nodded and guided the man to a table, not too far from Martin's. As he passed, Martin leaned back in his chair and muttered just loud enough to be heard, "Must be lost." A few nearby guests chuckled under their breath, exchanging glances. The black man paused for a split second but said nothing, keeping his posture straight. He sat down and picked up the menu, scanning it carefully. Martin smirked, turning back to his meal. People should know their place. A waiter approached the black man's table, looking slightly unsure. Sir, can I get you something to drink?" "Water, please," the man replied. Martin chuckled under his breath. "Of course. Can't afford anything else." Minutes passed. Martin continued his meal, but his attention kept drifting to the black man. Something about him was different. He sat with quiet confidence, unfazed by the stares, unaffected by the whispers. It was as if he knew something no one else did. Finally, unable to resist, Martin leaned over and spoke just loud enough for the black man to hear. "This must be a mistake," he said with a smirk. "You are clearly in the wrong place." The black man slowly lifted his eyes from the menu, meeting Martin's gaze. There was no anger, no embarrassment, just a quiet, knowing look. "I do not believe I am," he said simply. Martin let out a dry chuckle. "Really? You must be here to apply for a job in the kitchen, then." He took another sip of wine, waiting for laughter from the other guests. A few chuckled, but most remained silent, sensing something different about this exchange. The black man smiled, shaking his head. "No, I am here to eat." Martin scoffed. "Sure you are. Do you have any idea how expensive this place is? This is not some cheap diner." The man closed the menu and placed it down neatly. "I am well aware." Martin leaned forward. "Then tell me, how do you plan to pay for it?" The restaurant grew quieter. People were now watching. The waitstaff exchanged nervous glances. The black man smiled again, but this time, there was something behind his eyes, something calm, powerful. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a golden card. He placed it on the table, tapping it lightly with his finger. "I suppose," he said, his voice smooth and even, "the same way you do." Martin's smirk faltered. His eyes flickered to the card, then back to the man's face. Suddenly, the confidence he had felt moments ago wavered. Who are you?" Martin asked, his tone less mocking now, more curious. The man simply smiled. Just someone who has learned a few things in life. Martin narrowed his eyes. Something about this did not make sense. The waiter, now visibly nervous, stepped forward. "Would you like to order, sir?" he asked the black man. The man nodded. "Yes. I will have the filet mignon, medium rare. And a bottle of your finest wine." Martin's jaw clenched. That was the most expensive item on the menu. The waiter hesitated, then nodded and hurried away. Martin sat back, crossing his arms. "So, let me get this straight. You just walk in here, dressed like that, and expect us to believe you belong." The man's smile did not fade. "Why would my clothes determine that?" Martin scoffed. "Because in the real world, appearance matters." The black man tilted his head slightly. "Is that so?" Before Martin could reply, the waiter returned with the wine, carefully pouring a glass for the black man. He lifted it, studying the rich red color before taking a sip. He nodded approvingly. Martin watched, his confidence now mixed with irritation. Who was this man? "I have a feeling," the black man said, setting his glass down, "that before this meal is over, you will see things differently." Martin let out a dry chuckle. "Oh, and what makes you think that?" The black man smiled. "Because, my friend," he said, leaning forward slightly, "I have seen men like you before." Martin frowned. "Men like me?" The black man nodded. "Wealthy, powerful, arrogant." Martin felt a flicker of irritation. "And what exactly do you know about power?" The black man took another sip of wine before answering. "More than you think." The restaurant was now silent. Every eye was on them. Martin felt something unfamiliar, a slight unease creeping in. For the first time in a long time, he was not in control. And he did not like it. Martin leaned back in his chair, swirling the last drops of wine in his glass. The restaurant had fallen into an awkward silence, but he was too entertained to care. He smirked, tapping a finger against the table as he studied the black man across from him. The way he sat, the way he held himself, it did not fit. There was confidence, but Martin saw it as misplaced. He had seen men like this before, men who thought they were special just because they carried themselves with dignity. But dignity was not wealth. Dignity did not buy a table in a place like this. And yet, the black man remained unfazed. He sipped his wine slowly, as if savoring the moment, as if he had all the time in the world. That calmness irritated Martin. With a smirk, Martin set his glass down and leaned forward. "So," he said, his voice laced with amusement, "tell me something. How exactly do you afford this?" The black man glanced up, unbothered. "What do you mean?" Martin chuckled. "Come on, do not act like you do not know what I am talking about. Places like this? They are not for people like you." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. A few guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others, the ones who agreed with Martin, chuckled under their breath. The black man did not flinch. He simply placed his glass down and folded his hands on the table. "People like me?" he repeated, his voice calm. Martin gestured toward the man's clothes. "No offense, but you are not exactly dressed for a place like this. And let me guess, you work a 9-to-5 job, right? Maybe something simple?" A waiter passing by hesitated, unsure whether to intervene. The manager, standing near the bar, watched cautiously but said nothing. The black man smiled slightly. "And what is wrong with a simple job?" Martin laughed, shaking his head. "That is exactly my point. Hard work is great and all, but let us be real. Hard work does not make you rich. Connections do. Status does. You either have it or you do not." He leaned back, spreading his arms. "Look at me. I did not waste my time working a regular job. I made the right choices. And now," he smirked, "I get to enjoy places like this without worrying about the bill." The black man remained silent for a moment, studying Martin. His gaze was unreadable, as if he was looking straight through him. Martin mistook that silence for defeat. He chuckled, shaking his head. Look, man, I am not trying to be rude. I am just saying, know your place. A few guests stifled laughs. Some whispered among themselves, while others avoided eye contact, uncomfortable with the tension. The waiter, still hovering nearby, swallowed nervously. He stepped forward. Sir, he addressed the black man cautiously, would you like to order anything else? The black man glanced at Martin before turning back to the waiter. Yes, he said with a smile. I will have the crème brûlée for dessert. Martin let out a laugh. Oh, so now you are going all out? The black man shrugged. Why not? Martin shook his head, amused. He turned to the waiter and said, loud enough for others to hear, make sure he knows how much it costs. I would hate for there to be an incident. The waiter hesitated, then nodded before quickly walking away. Martin chuckled, shaking his head again. You really do not belong here. The black man tilted his head slightly. And why is that? Martin gestured around. Look at these people. Look at how they carry themselves. Wealth is not just about money, it is about class, about knowing how to act in places like this. The black man's smile did not waver. And how am I acting? Martin smirked, like someone pretending to fit in. There it was, the moment Martin had been waiting for. He could see it now, the subtle shift in the black man's expression. Maybe now, finally, he would realize that he did not belong. But the shift Martin saw was not embarrassment. It was something else entirely. Something unsettling. Before he could figure it out, the black man spoke again. Tell me, Martin, he said, his voice still steady. If I were wearing a tailored suit and an expensive watch, would you treat me differently? Martin chuckled, shaking his head. Look, man, you do not get it. It is not just about clothes. It is about presence. Confidence. The right kind of confidence. The black man nodded slowly. I see. Martin smirked. Glad you are finally getting it. The black man took another sip of wine. Then, with quiet certainty, he said, No, I was just wondering, what would happen if the roles were reversed? Martin frowned slightly. What? The black man leaned forward, meeting Martin's gaze directly. What if you were the one being judged? Martin scoffed, waving a hand. That would never happen. The black man smiled. Are you sure? Something about the way he said it sent a chill through Martin's spine. He was about to reply, but before he could, the waiter returned with the crème brûlée. Here you are, sir, he said, setting the dish down in front of the black man. Martin smirked. Enjoy it while you can. The black man picked up his spoon, but instead of eating, he looked at Martin. Oh, I will, he said. And so will you. Martin raised an eyebrow. Excuse me? The black man took a bite, savoring the dessert, before finally saying, because this night is far from over. Martin narrowed his eyes. What is that supposed to mean? The black man simply smiled, but for the first time that evening, Martin felt something he was not used to feeling. A sense of unease. A feeling that, somehow, he had underestimated the man sitting across from him. And something told him he was about to regret it. Martin was still smirking when the black man took another slow bite of his dessert. The arrogance in Martin's posture, the way he leaned back like he owned the world, had not wavered, at least not yet. But something had shifted. The black man did not seem offended. He was not angry. If anything, he looked amused. And that unsettled Martin. The restaurant's quiet murmur continued around them, though several guests were still stealing glances at their table. Some were entertained by the rich man's condescension, while others looked uncomfortable but remained silent. The waiter, who had just set down the crème brûlée, lingered near the bar, unsure if he should intervene. Then, the black man finally spoke. Martin, he said, his voice as calm as ever, do you believe that money makes a man better than others? Martin scoffed, swirling the wine in his glass. Obviously. That is just how the world works. The black man nodded thoughtfully. And you think that because you have wealth, you are in control? Martin chuckled. I do not think I know. He waved a hand. Money gives you options. Power. Influence. People respect you because they have to. It is just the way life is. The black man smiled slightly. Respect and fear are not the same thing. Martin raised an eyebrow. What is your point? The black man set his spoon down and folded his hands on the table. His gaze was steady, unshaken. Let me tell you a story. Martin let out a short laugh. A story? What is this, some kind of life lesson? The black man ignored the mockery. There was once a man who had everything: money, success, power. He looked down on others, thinking they were beneath him. He believed that because he had wealth, he was untouchable. Martin smirked. Sounds like a smart man. The black man continued as if he had not heard him. One night he met someone different. A man who had none of those things, but carried himself with the same confidence. The rich man laughed at him, mocked him, even tried to embarrass him in front of others. He thought nothing of it, because in his mind, that man's opinion did not matter. Martin tilted his head, pretending to look bored. Fascinating. What happened next? The black man smiled, but there was something in his expression that made Martin hesitate. The rich man found himself in a situation he could not control, and the very person he mocked was the only one who could help him. Martin let out a dry chuckle. Yeah? And what did he do? Did he beg? The black man shook his head. No. He did not have to. For the first time that night, Martin did not have a quick response. There was something unsettling about the way the black man said it, as if he knew something Martin did not. And then, something happened that Martin never expected. The black man reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black card. He placed it on the table and slid it across to Martin. Martin frowned, glancing down at it. Then his smirk returned. What is this? You trying to prove you have a credit card too? The black man simply said, turn it over. Martin sighed, picking up the card. But the moment he flipped it, the smirk on his face froze. His grip on the card tightened. His eyes narrowed as he reread the name engraved on it. It was a name he recognized. A name he had heard in business circles, a name associated with power, influence, and wealth. A name that should not have belonged to the man sitting across from him. Martin looked up slowly, his expression unreadable. You are joking. The black man simply smiled. Am I? Martin swallowed. That cannot be right. The black man leaned forward slightly. What? You thought I was just some ordinary man who wandered in here by mistake? Martin's mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked around, as if expecting someone to tell him this was some elaborate prank. But the restaurant was quiet. The guests who had been watching the exchange were now whispering among themselves, intrigued by the shift in dynamic. For the first time that evening, Martin felt a flicker of doubt. The black man picked up his spoon again, taking another slow bite of his dessert. Funny, is it not? How quickly assumptions can be proven wrong. Martin cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. So, you are rich? The black man raised an eyebrow. Does that change anything? Martin hesitated. I mean, yes. The black man nodded. Why? Martin let out a forced chuckle. Because, well, it means I was wrong. The black man tilted his head. About what? Martin shifted in his seat. About you. About everything. The black man smiled. And yet, nothing about me has changed since we sat down. Martin's smirk was gone now. He had spent the entire evening mocking this man, assuming he was beneath him. And yet, the entire time, he had been speaking to someone far more powerful than he had realized. A sinking feeling settled in Martin's chest. The black man leaned back, giving him a moment to absorb it all. Then, with quiet amusement, he said, Shall I continue my story? Martin nodded slowly. The black man's smile deepened. Good, because the lesson is just beginning. Martin sat frozen, his fingers gripping the black card as if holding it tighter would change what was in front of him. His mind raced. trying to piece together everything he had just learned. The man he had mocked, the man he had belittled in front of an audience, was not just anyone. He was someone powerful, someone important, someone he never should have underestimated. A lump formed in Martin's throat. He had spent years believing money made him untouchable. But now, he was sitting across from a man who had just flipped his entire perception upside down. And then, just when he thought the night could not get worse, it did. As Martin fumbled with his wine glass, still lost in thought, his hand slipped. The delicate glass tumbled off the table, shattering on the floor. A deep red stain bloomed across the crisp white tablecloth, dripping onto Martin's expensive suit. Gasps rippled through the restaurant. The waiter, who had been watching cautiously, hurried forward and asked if he was all right. Martin's face burned. He was used to watching others make mistakes, never himself. He had always been the one laughing, never the one embarrassed. But now eyes were on him, judging him, whispering. For the first time in years, he felt small. As he fumbled for a napkin, his other hand knocked over a candle holder. This time, it was not just the sound of glass breaking, it was the sound of fire licking at the edge of the tablecloth. Panic spread through the room. A waiter rushed to put it out, but Martin had already stumbled back in shock, colliding into another table. Plates clattered. A woman shrieked. This was not happening. Martin, the man who prided himself on control, was suddenly at the center of chaos. And no one was stepping in to help. No one, except him. The black man rose from his seat, his movements calm and measured. While others looked on in stunned silence, he acted. He grabbed a nearby water glass and poured it over the small flame before it could spread. The fire sizzled out instantly. Then, instead of laughing at Martin, instead of making a scene, he simply picked up a clean napkin and held it out. Martin hesitated, his pride warring with his embarrassment. He wanted to refuse. He wanted to pretend none of this had happened. But the way the black man looked at him, steady, unshaken, made it impossible. Martin took the napkin. His hands were trembling. He told himself it was just the shock of the moment, but deep down, he knew better. He had spent years treating others as lesser, assuming he was above them. And now, the very man he had insulted was the one helping him when no one else did. A waiter finally stepped in to clean up the mess. The restaurant slowly returned to its normal hum of conversation, though people still stole glances at Martin. But Martin barely noticed. His focus was entirely on the black man sitting across from him, as composed as ever, sipping his drink like nothing had happened. Martin swallowed hard and asked, "Why?" The black man looked up. "Why what?" Martin's voice was quieter now. "Why help me?" The black man set his glass down. "Because you needed it." Martin frowned. "After everything I said? After how I treated you?" The black man studied him for a moment before speaking. "Tell me, Martin, do you think kindness is something people have to earn?" Martin opened his mouth, then closed it. He had never thought about it that way before. The black man continued, "You believed money made you better than others. That power meant control. But tell me, where was your power just now?" Martin's stomach tightened. He had none. For the first time in his life, he had been completely helpless. And yet, the one person who should have had every reason to humiliate him had chosen to lift him up instead. The realization hit hard. He had always thought kindness was weakness. But looking at the man across from him now, he realized it was the opposite. Real power was not in wealth or status. It was in character. And right now, Martin had never felt smaller. Martin took a shaky breath. "I was wrong about you." The black man smiled, but it was not smug or triumphant. It was knowing. "I never needed you to be right about me," he said. "I just needed you to see for yourself." Martin's throat tightened. For years, he had lived by one belief. The world was built on power and money. That respect was something you could buy. But tonight, that belief had shattered just like his wine glass. He looked around. The whispers had faded. The tension had lifted. Life in the restaurant continued as if nothing had happened. But inside Martin, everything had changed. He turned back to the black man and, for the first time in a long time, spoke sincerely. "Thank you." The black man nodded, taking another sip of his drink. "Lesson learned." Martin let out a small, almost self-deprecating chuckle. "Yeah." The black man smiled. "Good." Because the real lesson had only just begun. Martin sat in silence, staring at his reflection in the restaurant's polished window. The usual confidence in his posture was gone. His shoulders, usually squared with arrogance, were slumped. His fingers traced the edge of his now empty glass, but his mind was far from the table. He could still hear the whispers that had filled the restaurant just moments ago. For the first time in years, he was not the one being admired. He was not the one in control. And the man he had belittled, the man he had laughed at, was the only one who had stepped up when he needed help. Martin exhaled slowly. "Can I ask you something?" His voice was quieter than usual, almost hesitant. The black man across from him nodded. "Go ahead." Martin ran a hand through his hair, searching for the right words. "Why did you help me? You could have watched me make a fool of myself. You could have laughed like I did at you." The black man tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. Then he said, "What would that have changed?" Martin frowned. "It would have given you the satisfaction of seeing me humiliated, of putting me in my place." A small smile touched the black man's lips. "And what would that prove? That I am just like you?" Martin had no answer to that. The black man leaned back in his chair, his expression calm. Power is not about stepping on others to feel taller. It is about lifting people up even when they do not deserve it. Martin swallowed hard. The words cut deeper than he expected. He had spent his entire life believing that wealth made a person valuable. That respect was something you could buy. But tonight, he had been stripped of all of that. When everything fell apart, his money did not save him. His reputation did not save him. The only person who had was the man he had treated like nothing. A strange heaviness settled in Martin's chest. It was not just embarrassment anymore, it was shame. "You are right," Martin admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I had everything figured out. That people like you, people without money, had nothing to offer me." He let out a bitter chuckle. "But I was the fool all along." The black man did not gloat. He did not say, "I told you so." He simply watched Martin with the same calm expression, waiting for him to process the truth on his own. Martin straightened in his chair. "I do not want to be that man anymore." For the first time that night, the black man's expression softened. "Then do something about it." Martin nodded. It was not an empty promise. He meant it. A waiter approached the table, ready to bring the check, but before he could speak, Martin reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He placed a few crisp bills on the table, enough to cover not just his meal, but the black man's as well. "For the lesson," Martin said. The black man studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod of approval. He did not thank Martin, because this was not about money. It was about understanding. As Martin rose from his seat, he felt different, lighter, as if shedding years of arrogance in a single night. He had spent his whole life thinking he was better than others. But now he understood true worth had nothing to do with wealth. Before leaving, Martin turned back to the black man. "I never got your name." The black man smiled. "Names do not matter. Actions do." Martin nodded slowly. Then, without another word, he walked away, not just out of the restaurant, but away from the man he used to be. Because tonight, he had learned the most valuable lesson of all. And this time, he would not forget it. Martin walked out of the restaurant, but this time, something felt different. The weight of his arrogance, the shield of superiority he had carried for years, felt lighter, almost as if it was slipping away with every step. The night air was cool against his skin, but his mind was still burning with everything that had just happened. He had spent his life believing that power came from wealth. That respect was something you could buy. But tonight, in front of a room full of people, all the money in the world could not save him from humiliation. And the man he had mocked, the man he had dismissed without a second thought, was the only one who had stepped in when no one else did. Martin stopped at the edge of the sidewalk, his thoughts spiraling. How many people had he treated like that before? How many times had he used his wealth to look down on others? He exhaled slowly. Too many. For the first time in his life, he felt ashamed, not because of what others thought of him, but because of who he had become. He turned back toward the restaurant, his feet moving before he could second-guess himself. When he stepped inside, the room was quieter than before. People still glanced in his direction, but this time, the looks were different. Less admiration, more curiosity. Martin did not care about their judgment anymore. He had only one thing on his mind. The black man was still seated at his table, sipping his drink, as if the events of the evening had never happened. He looked up as Martin approached, his expression unreadable. Martin took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology." The black man raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Martin hesitated for only a moment before pulling out a chair and sitting down across from him. "Not just for tonight, for every time I have treated someone like they were beneath me." His voice was steady, but his hands were clenched together. "I have spent my whole life believing that money makes a man important, that people without it do not matter. But I was wrong." The black man set his drink down and studied Martin carefully. Then, after a long pause, he said, "What are you going to do about it?" Martin thought about that for a moment. Empty words meant nothing. Regret without action was useless. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "I own several companies. I have resources, connections. I want to use them to help people who actually deserve a chance." The black man glanced at the card but did not take it. "And what about the ones who do not?" Martin frowned. "What do you mean?" The black man leaned forward slightly. "It is easy to help people you think are worthy. The ones who work hard, the ones who are struggling but trying. But what about the people who have made mistakes? The ones no one wants to give a second chance?" Martin opened his mouth to respond but stopped. He had never considered that before. Would he be willing to help someone who had nothing to offer in return? Slowly he nodded. "I do not know what that looks like yet, but I want to find out." The black man studied him for another long moment before finally nodding. "Then you are already on the right path." Martin felt something shift inside him. This was not just about one night, one mistake. It was about changing who he was at his core. He stood up and extended his hand. "Thank you. For everything." The black man shook his hand, firm but without ego. "Just remember, real power is not in what you have. It is in what you give." Martin nodded. This time he would not forget. As he stepped outside, the city lights stretched before him, the world looking different than it had just hours ago. He had spent his whole life chasing the wrong kind of success. Now, he was ready to build something real. And for the first time in years, he felt truly free. How many times have we judged someone without truly knowing their story? How often do we let arrogance blind us to the lessons life is trying to teach us? If this story made you think, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed a moment like this in real life? And if you believe that true power is not in what you have, but in what you give, hit that subscribe button. Because here, we share stories that remind us what really matters.